born and raised in Queens, but during graduate school I lived in Brooklyn, so it's kind of a homecoming a little bit. And now I'm in the cold hinterlands of Connecticut. I'll start with a point in kind of recent history, and then I'll move backward. So I always tell people that I wear two hats. I'm a historian and I'm a journalist. I do both of those things. And so part of the time I'm thinking about the past, and part of the chronicling the past, and part of the time I'm thinking about chronicling the present. And for me, intellectually, what I find most satisfying is fleshing out those connections between what has happened and what is happening. And so I like, keeping my mind in those two places. And one of the things I always say about teaching African American history is that one of the hazards of teaching it is that you're not quite sure what is actually in the past, because we find so many things recurring in the present. The saying is that history repeats itself, and I always like to revise that and say, no, history does not repeat itself, humans do. So history is not an inanimate force that operates on a cycle like a record that's been scratched and we hear it again and again. Humans do. We have the capacity to change things. When we notice the similarity in patterns, we have the capacity to say that we want to move in a different direction. And so, in looking at this film again, I haven't seen it since last year. I think I saw it the first time when it was completed, and I haven't seen it since then. And what it brought to mind was really this dynamic that has been kind of put into relief, has been made much more visible during the Obama administration. But for many of us, we've seen it, so often now that we could have predicted it or could have identified it outside of that. And what I mean by that is this: we were talking about Trayvon Martin, but I spent a good bit of my time last year in Ferguson, Missouri. And we could have had a similar conversation about this. And what I want to do is talk about that and its relationship to the history and some of the things that we saw there, and suggest some things that we might be wanting to think about in the future. So we are in an interesting point in history where we're both recognizing the anniversaries of significant milestones and seeing the erosion of those milestones in the present. More specifically, last year we saw the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, landmark Civil Rights Act, and we saw the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, these two things, a decade apart, really we think about those two things as brackets in terms of the history of the civil rights movement. There's another bracket in 1965, which is the Voting Rights Act, and the effort to push for that act was chronicled in the film by a good friend of mine, actually. I'm very proud of her, the recent film Selma, which if you haven't seen, I encourage you to see. It's a really wonderful treatment of that particular history. And we'll see the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act this year. In this context, that same summer, last summer, as we were looking at the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, we were seeing a slow motion riot take place in the city of Ferguson, Missouri. And unlike the circumstances we saw in the 1960s, at the tail end of the civil rights movement, really, we could have said the 50th anniversary of the Harlem Riot of 1964, and then coming up on the anniversaries of the riots in Watts, in Detroit, and the national spate of riots that happened after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. If we think about all those things, we're saying the dynamic here that is different is that in this context, we have a black president. We have a black attorney general, and the chief law enforcement officer of the United States is an African American, and yet we are dealing with a circumstance in which an unarmed man is shot between 6 and 8 times and left on the street in Canfield Drive in Ferguson, Missouri, in the United States of America. And what are the implications of that? So I think initially what Ferguson did was bring to the surface the indictment of the idea that we were or ever had been post-racial. It was a concern that I had when people first began talking about this in 2008. And so this was a conversation that had to be had very quietly lest people think that we were unduly pessimistic in the midst of something that we never thought that we would see. So for me, my parents were from Alabama and Georgia, and who understood very clearly the circumstances in which you were taking your life in your hands to attempt to vote. So to see an African American elected to the highest office in the land was a point at which you had to respect that. You had to respect the history and the sacrifice and the people who gave up their lives in order to make that happen. At the same time, the quiet conversation that we had among ourselves was that this might lend itself to the idea that there are no more struggles to be launched. So we just talk about the idea of being post-racial for a moment, and then we'll kind of return to this narrative, this bit of history that keeps imposing itself in the present. When I first saw the idea of post-racialism, and when we saw that Barack Obama had gotten 39% of the white vote in the United States, he got the minority of white voters, but a significant enough number that he was able to be elected president of the United States. And it was an amazing thing that had never happened before, and since a minority of white people were willing to vote for a candidate who did not share their racial background, a presidential candidate who did not share their racial background, the United States could pat itself on its back and now declare itself post-racial. In short, voting for someone for president who does not look like you means that for one election, white people did something that black people have done ever since the 15th Amendment. But we never looked at this and said, wow, there are people of color in this country who are willing to vote for people who don't look like them. We should commend them for being able to get beyond race. And so there was a kind of one-sidedness that was implicit in that idea from the outset. And in 2007, we saw the incident with Sean Bell, who was killed on the eve of his wedding. But it was easy to overlook in the context of the exuberance and the idealism and the exhilaration and the joy and pride and happiness that came with the inauguration of the first black president on January 20th, 2009. It was easy to overlook in that context the fact that that same month, 3 unarmed African Americans, 1 in Texas, 1 in New Orleans, 1 in San Francisco. Most notably, the one in San Francisco is the one people know well, Oscar Grant, because it was memorialized in the film Fruitvale Station. 3 unarmed black men were shot by police fatally in the same month that Barack Obama was inaugurated. And so, implicit in that very moment in which we were recognizing that there had been something achieved which we had never thought possible were seeds of the old recalcitrant racial order, sending a signal to us that it had not gone quietly into that good night. So in Ferguson, as I was in that community, I was kind of walking around, I was thinking about these things, the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and the fact that we were in a city in which there were, Brown being the kind of death knell of legalized segregation in this country. And we were in a community in which there is a majority, African-American majority, more than 70%, 71% of the population there black, and only 1 out of 6 city council people who are black. There's never been a black mayor in the city of Ferguson. There's never been a black police chief. There's never been a black fire chief. All the administrative services and political structure remain in the hands of a minority of white people in the city of Ferguson. And when the shooting of Michael Brown took place, it became kind of a referendum on all these broader questions about race, about class, about poverty, about political representation in the United States that had been just below the surface. So even though we see, in many of these instances, we see something that looks like police brutality, actually is police brutality. We think we're having a conversation about police brutality, but what we're actually having is a conversation about citizenship and the extent to which a person's citizenship exists and can exist uncompromised, or whether or not your freedom has an asterisk next to it, which has been the enduring question since emancipation in this country. And so, in this context, it looks like Ferguson is odd. And the year prior to this, we saw the Supreme Court eviscerate the Voting Rights Act, whose 50th anniversary we'll have this year. And in this, the argument, if you go back and read the opinions, the argument that's given in this is effectively that the Supreme Court feels that the Voting Rights Act, by establishing defenses for people who have, in states that have a history of disfranchising or attempting to minimize or dilute the power of black votes, specifically coming out of the history of the Civil Rights Movement and prior, in all these states that are covered by the Voting Rights Act, is in fact discriminatory against white Southerners. This is the basis that's used for striking down this law. Now, we should know that the opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 used this same argument. There's an Alabama congressman who says we cannot have a Civil Rights Act specifically for Negroes because our Constitution is colorblind. I'm sorry. Because our Constitution is colorblind and recognizes no different classes of people, we cannot carve out specific protections for one group of people, or else they will use those protections to oppress and exploit other groups of people in the society. This is actual argument. And it sounds absurd until we see that this is what has happened in 2014 with the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. And so, in this context, when we look at Ferguson, it starts to not look as strange as we might have thought. So a report by the Reflective Democracy Campaign pointed out that people of color, collectively, African Americans are about 13% of the population. If you include Latinos and Asians, we total about 37% of the population. So for that 37% of the population, 63% of the population is white, non-Latino, and that 63% of the population holds 90% of the elected offices in the United States. White men, who are about 35% of the population, hold 71% of the elected offices in the United States. Which is to say, we thought that we were talking about problems in Ferguson, Missouri, and we thought that Ferguson, Missouri was a asterisk in the odd circumstance in which this situation happened, but actually, to our dismay, Ferguson looks like America. Or we can say America looks like Ferguson. And so in this discussion, even as I kind of participated in this conversation about what's happened between the death of Martin Luther King and the election of Barack Obama, we've seen kind of tides moving in two directions. So there are points that we can say, all right, we've seen the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act at the same time that we've seen the election of a black president. Not coincidentally, the Voting Rights Act ended after an election, two elections actually, 2008 and 2012, in which for the first time in American history, African Americans voted at higher percentages than any other group in the population. Especially given in 2008 and 2012, one group had the highest electoral turnout of any group in the United States, and that demographic was black women voters. And in that context, it was said that we no longer need the Voting Rights Act protections, which is effectively like saying, we have seen a steep decline in the number of people who are driving drunk, so we think that we can get rid of those drunk driving laws now. And so because racism is habitual and enduring, and it's something that's in the national DNA, we can never be quite certain that it will not rear its head. It's like a chronic illness. You can try to keep it at bay or to treat it, but we have not yet found a cure that will completely rid ourselves of this affliction. And so looking at it in this context, looking at what happened in Ferguson and seeing it as kind of a touchstone, we can see that America has moved in two directions since Dr. King died. Black America has moved in two directions. On the one hand, you could point out the fact that between 1990 and 2010, the number of black people who were enrolled in college increased by 1.7 million, and so it more than doubled. So now about 3 million African Americans who are in college. Far more, by the way, this kind of statistic of doom that we sometimes hear that there are more black men in college, in prison than there are in college, is actually not true. The numbers of black people who are enrolling in colleges have skyrocketed. And we can say that now about 82% of African Americans who are over the age of 25 have a high school diploma. About 19% of African Americans have a college degree. And so when we talked about the turn of the 20th century, when W.E.B. Du Bois said that Black America needed to have a talented 10th, to be 10% of the population that had kind of achieved higher education and so on, and would be charged with leading the rest of Black America into the future. Lots of problems with that idea, but we could still say that now we're looking at double the percentage that W.E.B. Du Bois once fancied, once fantasized about having in terms of Black people who are college educated. By that same token, there are nearly 900,000 African Americans who are currently incarcerated. And the point that Michelle Alexander made in the documentary about incarceration serving to have the same effect on people's lives that Jim Crow did, foreclosing opportunities economically, foreclosing literally the physical place that you can occupy. And we've seen kind of attendant policies that increase the likelihood of someone being caught in the criminal justice system. In New York, stop and frisk specifically. And in many other places, the same policing policies that don't have that name, but nonetheless have the same kind of impact and outcome. And so we've seen these two directions that make it really very difficult to understand, to get a read on where we are. And so just one quick point, and then I would like for us to kind of entertain some questions. In 2004, Barack Obama's political future was really secured with a speech that he gave to the Democratic National Convention. Many of us remember that speech. People kind of lost their minds over that speech, and I remember writing at the time that compared to the speech that Jesse Jackson gave in 1988, I'd give Barack Obama's speech a B. And so I still stand by that. I don't think that was a particularly impressive speech, but it was a very smart speech. And in that speech, he said, there's not a Black America or white America, there's the United States of America. And this was blatantly not true. But it was politically very feasible. It was the equivalent of what Booker T. Washington said in 1895 when he gave the Atlanta Compromise speech, which he said that, we really don't hold a real concern about segregation. We're really mostly interested in economic rights, and, people have given you all a hard time, but we just want to get along. And for political purposes, that speech launched Booker T. Washington's career. There's a great deal of political capital that can be generated by assuaging white concerns about being called racist. And Barack Obama knew this, and he used it politically to his advantage. I don't hold that against him. And at the same time, our inability to grapple with the idea that there is very much a Black America and very much a white America, and very much a Latino America, and very much an Asian America, and more than we are willing to grapple with publicly, very much an entrenched poor America that cuts through all of these categories. And I think that is the real lens through which we have to understand what has happened between 1968 and 2008. And so one last thing that I'll say about this, and there was that moment in this film when Jesse Jackson was crying. You saw, we had to shed the tear. Some of us who remember this moment, who remember that campaign, I was writing about it at the time, remember that not very long before that, Jesse Jackson had threatened to castrate Barack Obama. You all remember that? Yeah, I remember I was writing an article about Jesse Jackson. I had just filed an article about Jesse Jackson and his impact on Barack Obama's capacity to actually be a viable presidential candidate. And I'd left the building, I'd left the magazine, and the editor called me back and said, hey, you have to change the article. He said he wants to castrate him. And I thought it was a bad joke, but this is actually what he said. But the thing that's important to recognize about this is that in a very real sense, in a way that we've never actually thought about, more than any one individual political figure, except for maybe Dr. King, Jesse Jackson is responsible for Barack Obama being president of the United States. It's something that we don't really think about. But when Jesse Jackson ran in 1988, which is not covered in this documentary, but when he ran in 1988, he got 7 million votes, large numbers of votes from white voters, from white Democrats, people who they did not think would ever vote for a black candidate. What sealed Obama's, I won't say his fate, but what actually made him viable as a presidential candidate was his win in Iowa. And if you looked at the tracking and the polling, African Americans were solidly in support of Hillary Clinton prior to Iowa. And the electoral logic of it was that there's no way that this person, he's a great candidate, he's smart, his wife is beautiful, great kids. There's no way white people are going to vote for him, so I'm not going to waste my vote. Which is a very kind of sophisticated reasoning, political reasoning. After Iowa, his numbers shot up among African Americans because he then became a viable candidate. He became viable in he won in a state that had a 4% black population, won the Iowa caucuses. And so this was thought to be unprecedented, but it wasn't. Because in 1988, Jesse Jackson won the Vermont primary, and Vermont has an even smaller black population than Iowa does. And what Jesse Jackson's 1988 campaign did, and what he did with those 7 million votes, was essentially create a template that the Barack Obama candidacy of 2008 followed. We can go through a whole lot of more detail about it, but that is actually how politically and electorally, and even in terms of the rules, in terms of how delegates are counted and apportioned and so on, all of this was tied back to Jesse Jackson's 1988 campaign, which was not so much thinking that these rule changes that they instilled in the Democratic Party, they weren't thinking that this was going to elect a black candidate. I interviewed Jesse Jackson's chief strategist, a man by the name of Ron Walters, before he passed away. And he said, no, we had no idea that a black person would become president because of this. What we were trying to do was make sure that poor black communities had as much political influence in the primary process as possible. And so through this, in 1988, concessions and things that Jesse Jackson wanted to happen and wanted to see changed in order to endorse, he said, before we will endorse Mr. Dukakis, we want to have a conversation about how we want the Democratic Party to function as it relates to black people. And these were the things they brought to the table that 20 years later enabled Barack Obama to become president of the United States. And so if we needed a more direct tie between Obama and the civil rights movement, then I don't think we could find one.
So why did he want to castrate him then?
I can't speak for him. But if you recall, during that spring, in which there were these primaries, and it was this competition between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton were both attempting to kind of connect themselves to the campaign, to the Obama campaign. And Obama, for kind of smart political reasons, did not embrace them in that way. And I think it generated a degree of acrimony about it. But also, I think that Jesse Jackson, for all of his kind of complexities as a character, was understandably disappointed that no one saw the connection. I mean, historians and political scientists did, but journalists didn't, and certainly voters didn't. People did not see the connection between what he did in 1984 and 88 and what Barack Obama was doing in 2008, and it generated resentment on his part. Were you going to say something?
Just going to ask, with 2 years remaining on President Obama's agenda as president, what do you foresee as the possibilities in terms of his accomplishments?
I'm going to take the historian's prerogative and say that we don't know. And I think that's important, though. I think that's important because, when Truman left office, he was widely disparaged, and now people think of Truman as a really significant president. And kind of history will tell how Obama will be understood. Certainly, I think there are things that his presidency is maybe a harbinger of, and that is the kind of demographic changes that are happening in this country, where we will soon be a population in which there is no racial majority. But we have racial pluralities, as it is now 63% of the population as non-Hispanic whites. And that number will dip to below 50% in coming years. And so the question is, what kind of society will we look like then? Will we look like a kind of low-octane version of South Africa, where there is a white population that retains disproportionate influence and power. Will Barack Obama's election have catalyzed that? Will kind of the reaction that we've seen, the kind of intransigent reaction and obstructionism that we've seen in our political structure, our political culture, will that become a more regular feature of how our politics operate? There are lots of things here that I think will kind of say that Barack Obama's election signaled the start of, but not, the end of his presidency will not be the end of those things. So that's a short way of saying time will tell. You in the back and then you over here. Yeah,
Thank you for your speech. It was really amazing.
Thank you.
My question is it's a little bit of background. So I've lived in Chicago and Detroit now for the last while. And I've noticed kind of a backsliding in black politicians who are elected and then either are not reelected or are taken out of office through scandal. And I am wondering kind of, like if we could hear your thoughts on kind of that phenomena and also the kind of double standard of like politicians, black politicians and white politicians and how they're judged historically.
Sure. Let's talk about Marion Barry. No, there's no uh-oh. I'll tell you this. I've said this for a long time. I voted for Marion Barry. I lived in Washington, D.C. I went to college in Washington, D.C. I voted for Marion Barry twice, one of which was after he was convicted of smoking crack. And that seems like a bizarre thing to do unless you actually lived in Washington, D.C. at the time. And so, what happened with Marion Barry was that he became shorthand for the political failures of that generation of black leaders who came to the fore in the 1970s after this Gary Convention that he talked about in 1972. So you had, Carl Stokes in Cleveland. You had Kenneth Gibson in Newark, who was later arrested, who was followed by Sharp James in Newark, who was later arrested. And then you had Harold Washington. He died in office. Tom Bradley, there was not any scandal. Probably the most highly regarded of that entire group was Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, who really created the infrastructure that we see Atlanta now being kind of a cornerstone of the metropolitan economies of the South. And so that, people will say Maynard Jackson and the rest of them were bums and so on. But in order to understand, what happened there was there are two things that we have to say, two things we have to recognize. One is that there's a great deal of graft and corruption in American politics, period. And the other is that, so going back to my Marion Barry example, one of my good friends, Adam Serwer, summed this up perfectly. Barry did not invent corruption in Washington, D.C. He changed who benefited from it. And so this is what happened in these cities. So what we talked about with Kenneth Gibson, who was arrested for graft and corruption, and Sharp James, who was arrested for graft and corruption, but we don't talk about is that the mayors who preceded them and the political figures in Newark who preceded them, Anthony Imperiali and Hugh Adonisio, were directly connected to the mob. And so what has happened, and I think there's an interesting piece that my colleague at the New Yorker, Malcolm Gladwell, wrote about this, about how organized crime became a stepladder into legitimacy for lots of ethnic groups, but it did not function that same way for black people. And so the unspoken rule of American politics is that you hook your people up. And very often your people is defined along ethnic lines. And when that began to happen with black political figures, I'm not necessarily saying this is right, but what I am saying is that there's kind of a hypocrisy around saying that it's wrong when black political figures did it, when this had been kind of how American politics functioned, period. And so I think that's, even, Robert Wagner, who was the mayor in 1950s New York City mayor. And his mayoralty was constant. We talked about the Wagner houses. That's why I mentioned it. The Wagner houses in this film is named after a mayor whose administration was racked by concerns about corruption. And so this is kind of how New York City politics and big city metropolitan politics have functioned for a really long time. You had a question.
You'd mentioned that the number of black males incarcerated is not more than the number of black males in higher education. As someone that works in education, can you talk a little bit about retention levels, which seem to be absolutely staggering?
In higher education, certainly. I can speak to higher education because that's kind of the arena where I am. But there are these dynamics which are directly related to socioeconomic factors around black male retention. So the last year for which I saw statistics, which wasn't that recent, but I think it was 2009 or so, routinely double the number of black women graduate from college as the numbers of black men. And there are a few reasons for this. I've actually seen this both from the research perspective, and I've actually seen this kind of in terms of my actual interaction with people. One of which is that in many instances, myself included, people drop out of school because they don't have enough money. So I went to Howard University. I graduated 7 years after I began. And that was because after 3 years, I didn't have any money and I had to quit school. I worked and then finally got an opportunity, a little bit of daylight, and I came back and finished. Very often that doesn't happen. And so what the typical trajectory is that especially if there's economic hard times. And so we still kind of have expectations around what men are supposed to do and what young men are supposed to do and what young women are supposed to do. And so if you have a 20-year-old who's in school, who's not generating income, but is going to class and so on, and then the family falls upon hard times, it's easier for us to kind of think of this person going out and getting a job. In which we don't necessarily put the same pressure to get a job on our daughters that we put on our sons, and so that happens. The other dynamic, however, is that for part of the reason that double the number of black women graduate from college is that for a good number of these young men, they're actually leaving for employment in fields in which kind of the traditional route you'd see men find work in, which is police officers, truck drivers, blue-collar labor union kind of work, and also kind of civic, city, the kind of municipal job that with the good benefits. That is where young African-American men who leave college wind up tracking to. And then in addition to that, there's also the dynamics of the criminal justice system, which reduces the number of black men who even go into college in the first place. Even if it's not more, there are young men who are not in college precisely because they are incarcerated. So all those dynamics go into why our profile looks the way that it does. Also, I think while we're here, we could talk about one other thing, which brings up this kind of important point, which no one asks, but I really like talking about this question anyway because it comes up all the time, and I feel like you should just go ahead and put it out there, which is one of the things that's most curious is the way in which we discuss crime. It happens all the time, too. When we saw the Michael Brown situation, when we saw the Trayvon Martin situation, I was in Prague. At a conference about a week after George Zimmerman was acquitted, and I was with a group of other historians, and we're kind of chilling. We're in Prague, right? We're having a good time. And he's like, we have to go to a conference and give a paper, but after we give the paper, we are hanging out in Prague. And one of the papers my paper was about race and American democracy and kind of some of the things we've talked about here this evening. And the only people, this is an international conference, the only thing that people wanted to talk about was what had happened with Trayvon Martin and how is it that you can shoot someone who doesn't have a gun and not be found guilty of a crime. And so this becomes the conversation. There are people from all over the world, right? Just 12 or 15 countries represented in this one room. And so there's a white American scholar who attended the panel, and he stands up and says, well, if you're going to talk about this, you need to talk about black-on-black crime. I was like, man, you brought that all the way over here? We got a whole other country, and you're having this argument over here? But I find it curious. It's a really curious thing, like when we think about it, because what happens is that I think we're supposed to recoil in fear when people bring this up, because it's kind of like this secret shame, around it. But it's a very bizarre kind of argument, because it would be equivalent of saying, well, we know that your wife was killed by a burglar, but statistically speaking, she's more likely to be killed by her husband, which is true. We don't talk about people in terms of demographic probabilities in any other context. We don't say, well, okay, you were a victim of, we don't look at terrorism, which is true, another stat. We don't look at 9/11 and say, well, that year, more than 10 times that number of people died of the flu. So, the flu is really more dangerous to you than Osama bin Laden. We would have been outraged by that argument because those two things are completely unrelated. And so what it means is that there's this kind of idea of collective responsibility, that if someone else commits a crime, then your claim to innocence and your relationship to your government can only be understood by the actions of people outside yourself. Then beyond this, it also presumes that people should hold the same standard for their government that they hold for people who are criminals. So if someone says, oh, okay, well, people kill each other all the time, why are you upset that the police do it? It was like, well, I don't pay people who kill me. And I don't have a constitutional right to redress. You don't actually go out and picket people. The Constitution does not say if there's a serial killer in your neighborhood, you should go picket that person. But the Constitution directly says that you have the right to petition your government. And so what people find is a kind of cynical approach is actually a deeply patriotic one that says, if you are a person who in fact, as black people in this society do, grapple with a much higher percentage, much higher likelihood of being a victim of violent crime, then it's all the more important that people approach you in a policing fashion that is actually humane and not less. And so I think this is another dynamic that we look at here. Now, the last thing I'll say about this, too, is that we know since about 1993 and 1994 that crime has been plummeting. And people in New York know this as well. Very much so. It's actually visible here in terms of what you see and what you don't see in the city. I lived here for all my life until I went off to college. And so what's weird about that is that if in fact this were the case, if in fact we were talking about so-called black-on-black crime, then there should be less racism. Because, crime is homicides in New York are about 20% of what they were at their peak. So we should have 80% less racism if this is really about black-on-black crime, but we don't. This is how we know that we're dealing with a kind of superstitious illogic here. And these are also dynamics, I think, that go into how these things played out. I'm not sure how much time I have, but, okay, then let's talk. You can say in the blue shirt.
Hi, I come from India, so
Okay.
even our society is like this, where, it's not divided by race, but instead we have caste system.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, with this class system, the way this thing was worked is we introduced a reservation system saying, okay, everyone gets an equal opportunity. And even when we had a prime minister who was from the backward class, who was, again, like you said, a moderate. Mm-hmm. He was not somebody who said, okay, we want to bring my class up or something like that. But after he came and went, there were no policies which changed. Everything is the same. Mm-hmm. But what we feel is, economically, the backward classes are still where they were before. Mm-hmm. And that's what's preventing them to come up from. So that's a common perception in our country. So do you think, in a country like America, that's happening, where, a different race, which is not the majority white, is economically suppressed somehow from reaching a full potential, and so there is no change that is really happening?
Oh, that's the story of the Obama administration, and so we saw this, in those circumstances that he took office under. One of the things that was scary in 2008 and 2009 is that Barack Obama was elected in the same kinds of circumstances that this class of black mayors was elected into, which is that most of those people who I mentioned took power in cities that were declining economically. And so they showed up just in time to be left with the bag for these declining tax bases and so on. And so seeing that a black president was elected at a point where there was, staggering economic malaise and difficulty, it led you to believe that these things might play themselves out the same way, and that he would find yourself caught in this kind of racial bind that, in some ways, recalled to me what the Dinkins administration was like in New York City. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it's also kind of history doesn't lend itself to the kind of idealism that we engaged in, that we indulged at that point in time. And so the best example is that there have been female heads of state in countries that continue to have deep problems with sexism. We talk about Benazir Bhutto, or we could talk about Margaret Thatcher, or we could talk about, there are lots of female heads of state, Indira Gandhi, people who have presided over societies that nonetheless remain patriarchal and sexist. We could talk about how the fact that a man in a wheelchair led this country through the Great Depression and through World War II, yet 45 years after he died in 1990, we still needed an Americans with Disabilities Act because people with disabilities were not fully enfranchised into society. So there's a kind of idea that we'd like to believe, and like Barack Obama, the analogy I thought was most apt was Franklin Roosevelt, because Franklin Roosevelt had to cloak his status as a person with a disability. That had to be kept hidden from public view. And it's not, and I don't mean to beat up on the president, that's not what I'm doing. I'm just talking about the actual phenomenon that we've seen here, the way in which race has kind of been something that had to have had, to the greatest extent possible, to be kept in the back, in the same way that, Franklin Roosevelt could not be discussed as this person of a whole other magnitude of leadership who, despite his physical limitations, held the country together through these twin trials of the Great Depression and World War II. And that should have been the only conversation that we needed to have about the possibilities of people with disabilities, but we never had that conversation. And I fear that we could end the Obama era with a kind of metaphorical similarity. I think we can do two or three more questions. Okay, let's do 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll get out of here. We can do it quick.
Now that he's leaving the administration, what would you say is Eric Holder's legacy to America generally and specifically for people of color?
I think the same thing that I was saying to the earlier question. I'm not quite sure what his legacy will be to people of color. I think it's important that he launched investigations. One of the things there are two things I think are important now. One is that his Department of Justice has been very aggressive about dealing with potential voter suppression instances, and I think that is something that we're going to be dealing with for a good while. And the other is, even before anything in Ferguson, even before there was anything with Trayvon Martin, his administration, his Department of Justice was very kind of forward-looking on issues of racial profiling. So they were addressing these issues, like in Arizona with the Sheriff Joe Arpaio and what he was doing with people of Latino background and so on. And so the Department of Justice has been very aggressive about that. There's a whole other side of things outside of this, if we're talking about civil liberties, which become very, very troubling in terms of the way that the administration has handled, spying as a journalist, tapping the phones of reporters, which the Department of Justice did. The handling of the extent to which the Americans are under surveillance. And these are things I think are important because when we looked at the March on Washington in 1963, and the people who got up, every single black leader who was on that stage was under surveillance by the FBI. And now everyone else is. And so it kind of lends itself to this question of like, what what will be the outcome of this down the line? Like, once you've created this tool, this mechanism, how do we then curb its parameters? If we think about 2008, one of the things that Barack Obama promised was that as a person who had taught constitutional law, he would respect the Constitution. And we were thinking implicitly about things like unwarranted wiretaps and so on. And I don't know what his legacy will be on that right now, but those are things I just have questions about. I think there was a question over here.
Why do you think Obama is shy to comment about racial issues?
I was talking to a journalist yesterday about Twitter, and he's a TV anchor, and he said, someone asked him why he was not on Twitter, and he said, Twitter can't make me any money, but it can get me fired. And I think that's how Barack Obama sees race. And I think that for a good extent, so one of the things that's happened is that even as his poll numbers have dropped, when his poll numbers went at the lowest, he still retained a high degree of support among African Americans. And some people said that they thought this was uncritical, that no matter what happened, black people were going to support him. I think there are some people who are like that, certainly, related to some of them, right? But I think the other thing is that people were looking at him in the context in which he exists. So I said that, they look at his relationship with the Republicans in Congress and kind of think of themselves and, the white people at their job, who might not be really that intent on seeing a talented black person do well. I'm not saying everybody, but I'm just saying some of us have had that experience. And I think that people understood Barack Obama, graded him, I think African Americans graded him on a curve for that reason. And one of the other things I think that's interesting is that, excuse me? Oh, on a curve, right. One of the things I think that's also interesting about that is that when he has talked to African Americans, he's tended to do it in a very chastising way, which, in some places does not play well, but with a good number of people it does. It does play well. And the reason for that, I think, is that people would say when Barack Obama talks, in these chastising terms to African Americans, he's pandering to white people. And I was like, well, he is pandering. You're right about the pandering, but he's actually pandering to black people. Because what I think he's saying, what I think he's doing is saying, I'm so much one of you that I'm frustrated by the same things you are. And so the way that we talk among ourselves, around family or after church or whenever it is, when we just are kind of like, ain't no good reason for him to not have no job, da-da-da-da. That conversation, that he's actually saying, I am part of the black community, so I'm having that same conversation. And I think that's at least politically why his rhetoric around African Americans looks the way that it does.
We have demonstrated, we have lost our heroes. Going forward, can you give us the assurance that things are being organized to deal with what have become very subtle and hidden kinds of issues for the black?
Yeah, I actually can. The question was, can I give assurances that things are being organized to deal with, the subtle things and the issues that are to come? And I actually think I can answer that. I think I can answer that affirmatively. And the reason I say that is this: from my vantage point as a historian, the joke they say about historians is that they start out looking backward and sometimes end up thinking that way. But for those of us who try to look backward while thinking forward, what I think comes to light is that the obstacles behind us are bigger than the obstacles in front of us. And so I think that it required more effort for people to end lynching. And I think it took more effort for people to, the tremendous will. I think whenever I'm kind of doubtful about these possibilities, I think about the tremendous will it took for people to escape slavery and then turn around and sign into the Union Army and risk re-enslavement in order to try to get everyone else out of slavery. And so when people make the argument that, black people can't come together, I was like, those people did. And nobody understands slavery, the horrors of slavery, better than someone who has been a slave. And so the kind of moral ethic that said, I will escape slavery, and then I will do everything that I can to make sure that none of my people is a slave, I think inspires me. And I think that even though we have kind of threads that, fray, or we have setbacks, or we have complications, I look at the fact that, my father, for instance, had a third-grade education, and came from a place called Hazelhurst, Georgia. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of it. Right, because if you had raised your hand, I would have said you're not telling the truth. Came from a place called Hazelhurst, Georgia, had a third-grade education, but left Hazelhurst because he wanted his children to be able to do something better than what he was able to do in terms of education. And so I look at that narrative and say that if past behavior is the best predictor of future actions, then I think that people will continue to fight until there's a full recognition of people's humanity. Oh, the modern tools. Psst. All those things. Listen. So for the digital, for the things that are going on in the digital age, like African Americans are disproportionately users of things like Twitter. The people who organized everything that happened in Ferguson were really young people. The protests that I participated in, no one even knew where the protests would be until they got a text message about 2 hours before. I think there are all sorts of things that will happen. I'm not the best person to tell you that about those specific things. I'm 45 and I'm grappling with the fact that I'm not in the category of young anymore. But but I think there are young people who could answer that question better than I could. But yeah, I think there was a question back there. And then, okay, there's one question, these last two, and then we're gonna wrap up.
I was really surprised I didn't hear anything about Eric Garner from your comments today.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that actually was more devastating than Mike Brown, because we had a video demonstrating that this man was simply asking, why are you bothering me?
Mm-hmm.
And then he winds up dying. And I just would like you to speak on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. No, it was just kind of one of the things I think is like a problem is that when we start having these conversations, I always feel bad because there's somebody who I did not speak about. And the problem is that there are so many people to speak about. But if we want to talk about Eric Garner, I think there are a number of things implicit in what happened to Mr. Garner. That if we saw the way that history kind of works in this loop, when Eric Garner was killed, I saw that video, like most people did, and like many people did, it recalled the scene from Do the Right Thing, with the death of the character named Radio Raheem. Even before Spike Lee did the video mashup and put it up on the internet of the scene from Radio Raheem's death and the scene from Eric Garner's death, that those two things were parallel. And so people thought this was an instance of art imitating life, or rather life imitating art. I was like, but it's actually not that simple, because when you think about it, the Radio Raheem scene was in fact a play off of the 1983 death of Michael Stewart. So it was a case of art imitating history that then replays itself in real life. And that's what I meant by that cycle of, history doesn't repeat itself, humans do. And so even outside of that, we had the videotape of this. And what was, I think, most troubling was that we again got into this narrative about needing a perfect victim. This person had been arrested 31 times, so what was happening in that particular moment, and what happened to this person. Certainly we're not going to say that someone selling cigarettes is worthy of a response with 5 police officers. That's not the logic that we want to entertain. There's also this kind of idea of resisting arrest, which also was a narrative that people talked about. It's curious because at the same time that we're having this conversation, there's this other national conversation that completely overlooks black people about the limits of state authority. And so when we looked out in, was it Colorado, with this gentleman who had the ranch, excuse me? Cliven Bundy, and he's saying that the government is trampling on his rights, and Rand Paul runs out to support him, and there are all these libertarian figures who are saying that we have to talk about the checks on government authority and so on. But what would happen if this was a routine dynamic in your society? Like, it's the same kind of idea that we saw with Eric Garner as kind of what is permissible, the circumstances, what are permissible for black people in the society versus what's permissible for the rest of the society. And the kind of economic equivalent of this was during the Great Recession. So we saw Occupy Wall Street that emerged when national unemployment was about 9.5%. It was actually higher than that, but let's just round up and say 10% unemployment. And Occupy Wall Street emerges, and people are saying, we are the 99%, and we have to talk about inequality, and we have to talk about the way that the economic system is not functioning for people, and so on and so forth, da-da-da-da-da. Never mind the fact that black people would be partying in the streets if we could get our unemployment rate down to 9.5%. Like, we are habitually in double-digit unemployment. And so the idea is that these circumstances that black people have been living in, and if we want to talk about this, we can say, let's get rid of all the stereotypes. Say, okay, well, who are these people? Maybe they have work problems and so on. Even when we're talking about college-educated black people, the unemployment rate is still double for college-educated black people as it is for college-educated whites. And for every category, with the exception of a few, black people at same educational ranking earn less money than their white peers. Again, we know these things as dynamics. Yet and still, the idea is that America cannot be correct. There has to be systemic reform. There are huge problems. Let's have demonstrations across the country. If our economic status begins to look like conditions that black people have existed in since we came here, since emancipation. And so bringing this back to Eric Garner, it's like, what would happen in this country if this was a routine experience? If white citizens could be expected to say, well, there are other white people who've committed some crimes, so therefore we're actually going to treat you in this way. We're going to stop you habitually when you walk out of your house, and we're going to frisk you. And if you have a problem with that, we may send 5 people who will arrest you or detain you in such a violent way that it will culminate in the loss of your life. What would happen? We'd have riots, is what would happen. And so that's troubling on a lot of levels, especially even given the kind of way that the police responded to this, which was effectively a mutiny. Which is kind of interesting when people say, oh, okay, well, we're going to turn our back on the mayor and so on, which is basically, effectively saying we're going to mutiny against the official civic leadership here. But it was bizarre because after this, they said we're going to actually have this slowdown where we won't be doing unnecessary arrests, which is like saying, I'm going to penalize you by giving you a raise. I'm going to do exactly what it is you've been asking all along, and not arresting people for reasons that they should not be arrested. And so I think that this is troublesome. I don't know the answer to all of that, but it is something that we're going to have to grapple with. It's not unfamiliar. So this is the one last question.
Hi, I would like to know, do you think that if more black men entered the field of law, that it will change or end police brutality toward black men?
Mm-hmm. If more black men enter the field of law, do you mean law or law enforcement?
Not law enforcement,
Uh-huh.
but then the blue-collar jobs that we're talking about, such as becoming a police officer.
Uh-huh.
In my experience, today I see more black police cops than I do white.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to know if black men hold the position to change policies or to create laws such as Congress. I would like to know, do you think they would have the ability to change the minds of will change the police brutality that is occurring toward black men?
This is the part where I feel like a pessimist. I wish that were the case. I'm not sure that is the case. Excuse me? Yeah, the reason I say that is this. There was a black officer on the scene when Sean Bell was killed, and there was a black officer on the scene when Eric Garner was killed. And so it's the context in which people operate. And so one of the things we find, even when we talk about the educational system, in most major cities, well, I'll just talk about the city that I lived in most recently, which was Atlanta, where there's a huge scandal, about this, about cheating and people changing tests and so on. And one part of this is about the kind of tyranny of the testing culture. But the other part of this was that there were lots of people, very many of them who looked just like us, who were poorly functioning in the educational system, who were depriving black and brown children of a quality education. So simply changing the color of the people who were in charge did not change the problems within the system itself. And so I think that I'd hope, certainly in my lifetime, I've benefited from people who went out of the way specifically because they wanted to see another African American succeed. And I had teachers, not all of whom were black, but very many of them who were black, who saw in me some reflection of themselves and went the extra mile. So maybe that's part of it. But I think the bigger thing is that how do we create a system that deals with poor people humanely and deals with black and brown people of any background humanely? And I think that that's something that's beyond. But even when we look at kind of statistically, with implicit bias, you show kind of images and what people associate with it. We find that the majority of white people associate negative images with black people, but a significant, I think it's like about 70% of whites, when you do these implicit bias tests, show some sort of favoritism toward white people or some kind of negative associations with black people. But about 35% of black people do too. And so that's really troublesome. Like, we really are going to have, this is not something that we can resolve simply. I think that would be part of it. Having people who are better trained of all backgrounds, having more people of color would probably help some, but I don't think that's going to resolve the whole problem.